he even like said he's a fucking dickhead. Like, look, you look at the guy like, and I don't like the fact that, look, Francis and the UFC have beef, but you can never erase him from history. You could never erase him from history. He was and is one of the inaugural parts of this shit in the UFC, what we did.
So Israel Adesanya has called out Dana White and the UFC for erasing Francis Ngannou's history in the UFC. First, I'll give you some context behind the story, and then we'll listen to what Israel had to say about Dana White and the UFC erasing Francis's history from the UFC. So just to give some context, recently the UFC released the traditional UFC Countdown episode ahead of UFC 305, and in the episode the UFC featured a quote from Israel Adesanya where he mentioned Dricus Du Plessis dismissing previous African champions such as Francis Ngannou, Kamaru Usman, and Israel Adesanya. But ironically, the UFC cut out Israel's mention of Francis Ngannou in this section. And this was brought to my attention by Adam Feldman MMA, and Adam says the first rule of UFC Fight Club, don't mention Francis Ngannou's name. Here's a look of the clip of the UFC 305 Countdown episode versus what Adesanya actually said at the 305 pre-sale press conference. It's no surprise, but the UFC's attempt to erase Francis from its history is an odd move. From falsely claiming that Tafon Nchukwi was the first Cameroonian fighter in the promotion's history to editing Ngannou's name out of all Countdown and UFC content, it's an interesting choice. Now this is a side-by-side comparison of the UFC's edit of what Israel said compared to what he actually said at the press conference.
There'll be a bit of tension between yourself and Dricus. Can you just run through why that is?
There's always tension whenever you fight anyone. This is a fight at the end of the day. We're not playing chess, we're fighting. So there's always gonna be tension there. But then him discrediting me, Kamaru Usman, he came in the UFC, I knew who he was a little bit, but I didn't go, oh, who the f is this fake dude coming in? I just said, cool, there's another African in the UFC. That ticked me off a little bit, so that's what started this. But again, I'll finish it. And also again, he tried to discredit the Three Kings and say that he's the real true African champion. And I was just like, it's a weird mindset, bro. Like, he came in the UFC, I knew who he was a little bit, but I didn't go, oh, who the fuck's this fake dude coming in? I just said, cool, there's another African in the UFC. But then him discrediting me, Francis Ngannou, Kamaru Usman, that ticked me off a little bit. So that's what started this. But again, I'll finish it.
Now, in the comments, Adam Feldman also added another recent quote from Israel Adesanya criticizing the UFC for removing Francis Ngannou's name from UFC history. And Adam says Israel Adesanya had a clear message today at the UFC 305 Media Day. You can never erase Francis's history from UFC. I'll say that. It's part of history. We need to fix this. I don't like that. And in the comments, one fan reacted saying, have you considered that Francis has told the UFC they are not to use his name or highlights to promote their fights? And Adam reacted saying Ngannou has made it pretty clear that is not the case. And as you can see here, he actually included a tweet from Francis Ngannou showing the UFC deleting his name out of UFC content. Francis says, hey bro, Kamaru Usman, that's a nice shirt you have there, but I can't see what is in front. And as you can see here, it's blurred out on the front of its t-shirt, and it was actually a picture of Francis Ngannou. Adam Feldman also shared another tweet from Francis Ngannou where he posted this picture showing himself as the first Cameroonian African champion, but on the UFC broadcast they completely discredited Francis as the first Cameroonian UFC champion, and they actually named Tafon Nchukwi as the first Cameroonian fighter in UFC history. So as you can see there, two instances where the UFC were blatantly trying to discredit and erase Francis's name from the UFC. Another fan reacted saying, why is this weird? Why give any shine off the UFC's grind? And Adam Feldman reacted saying, I completely understand not playing Ngannou's highlights or marketing a fighter who's no longer in their promotion, but editing out mentions of his name from interviews and content seems a bit unnecessary. Yesterday on his YouTube channel, Israel Adesanya doubled down on his comments about the UFC and Dana White trying to discredit Francis Ngannou's history in the UFC, and he also criticized Dricus Du Plessis for discrediting all previous UFC champions, including himself, Kamaru Usman, and Francis Ngannou. Here's what Israel had to say about the situation.
I'm a real African. Who the fuck says that? It's fucking stupid. And then shout out to Razak. He even like said he's a fucking dickhead. Like, look, you look at the guy like, and I don't like the fact that, look, Francis and the UFC have beef, but you can never erase him from history. You could never erase him from history. He was and is one of the inaugural parts of this shit in the UFC. What we did forever is going to be in history. You can never ever write it out of history. But like, Francis had to leave Cameroon and cross the Sahara or desert and get sent back there to die 6 or 7 times to make a better life for himself. Is he not a fighter? Is he not a warrior? Is he not a champion? Most people would have died. Dricus won't survive that. Wallahi. For where? Send him back to the desert. Go find your way back. See if he'll survive. So yeah, for him to say, I'm a real African, that just speaks volumes.
Okay, so let me just give my opinion on this entire situation. Now, I'm going to look at it from both perspectives. I'm going to look at it from Francis Ngannou's perspective, and I'm going to look at it from Dana White and the UFC's perspective. So let's go with Francis Ngannou's perspective first. Obviously, he has one of the greatest stories in UFC history in terms of his journey from where he came from to where he ended up as a UFC champion. And as Israel said, he literally traveled across the desert to get to the UFC and became a UFC champion, which is a phenomenal story. Also, you know, he put a lot of blood, sweat and tears on the line. He put his body on the line, his brain cells on the line, and he trained very hard to earn his position as a UFC champion. So for the UFC to kind of discredit that and to try and erase that from Francis's perspective, that is very disrespectful, because he has earned his right in UFC history and he does deserve to be mentioned as one of the first African champions in UFC history. Now, from the UFC's perspective and Dana White's perspective, the fact that they are taking him out of UFC content and editing out any mention of his name, from a business perspective, this makes complete sense for them, because people need to remember Francis Ngannou is on the opposite side now. He is a partner in a rival promotion to the UFC. PFL is publicly competing with the UFC, so the UFC is taking Francis's name out because they don't want to promote him, they don't want to give him any shine, they don't want to use their marketing budget to promote Francis Ngannou, and any promotion of his name, whether it's on the UFC platform or ESPN or wherever, that indirectly benefits Francis in the PFL. So from a business standpoint, this makes perfect sense, because they're not going to spend millions of dollars promoting UFC content on their platforms and on ESPN and to millions of viewers around the world. They're not going to promote Francis, who is a PFL fighter, on their platform. So for this reason, I personally understand why they are cutting his name out of their content, because this is their content, this is their platform, and they don't want to promote Francis Ngannou. But that's my thoughts on the situation. I do understand it from both perspectives, from the fighter's perspective, Francis's perspective. I also understand it from the UFC and Dana White's perspective, the business perspective. But give me your thoughts in the comments, guys. Let me know what you think on the situation. Do you think the UFC is wrong for cutting out Francis Ngannou out of their content? Or do you agree with their decision of cutting Francis Ngannou out of their UFC content? But that's going to wrap it up for today's video, guys. If you enjoyed the content, please consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.